This is Chapter 8, Solving Linear Equations, aka Algebra, your chapter final for Chapter 8 on algebra. The first four questions were true and false. It says, in the equation 2.5 multiplied by x minus 5 equals 7.5. The first step to isolate for x is to add 5 to both sides. The answer is false. And the reason why it's false is it appears, if you didn't understand anything about this question, that minus 5 is the constant. But in fact, if you expanded this equation, you would end up with 2.5x minus 12.5 equals 7.5. So in actual fact, adding 12.5 to both sides would be okay for your first step. Another one would be dividing both sides by 2.5 would probably be another thing, another best first step. But definitely adding 5 to both sides is a false statement, and therefore proving it any way you want would be sufficient. In question 2, the equation 4.5 divided by x equals 9 is a one-step equation. Again, that's false, because in this equation, the first thing we would need to do is multiply both sides by x. That's one step. But we end up with 4.5 equals 9x, which then our second step would be divide both sides by 9, and x would equal a half. Right? So the answer is false. It's a two-step. The third question, I was very lenient because I did say the best first step in the equation 5x minus 2 equals 4x minus 1 is to add 2 to both sides. The answer is false. That's not the best first step, because as we said before, when you have variables on both sides, the best first step is to get rid of the variable on the side with the least amount. So technically, the best first step is to remove 4x from both sides. But I was lenient depending on how you argued your point, and it didn't really matter because any first step is fine. But I did say the best first step, which changed the dynamic of the question a little bit. And finally, your last question, the coefficient in the equation, negative 2.5 multiplied by negative 2x minus 4 equals negative 5. The coefficient is 5. Well, you might have said false, it's negative 5. And then I'd be like, no, that's not true. If you expanded this using distributive property, negative 2.5 times negative 2 is 5. So it would become this equation. So this equation here and this equation here are the same thing. And when we look at it in expanded form, we do see that the coefficient is 5. So therefore, this is true. The coefficient is 5. Question 5 is a fraction question. It says half of x is equal to 4/5. You could have rewritten it like this. And if you did that, you could divide by a half to get rid of the coefficient of multiplying by a half. But dividing by a half is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal, in which case x would equal 8/5 or 1 3/5. If you rewrote the half of x like this, you would be multiplying by 2 right away, and your x would equal 8/5 or 1 3/5, depending on how you interpret it. So either way, if you're dividing by a half or multiplying by 2, they are the same operation in terms of the value of an equation, to an equation. Question 6, simple question with a decimal coefficient, dividing both sides by the coefficient. Now don't grab a calculator right away, because again, we're dividing by a half here, or in this case, a negative half. And dividing by a negative half is the same thing as multiplying by its reciprocal. So if you think about it, negative 4.2 divided by a half is going to be doubling that 4.2. So the answer is going to be x equals a positive 8.4, right? A negative divided by a negative. So question 6, the answer is x equals positive 8.4. Question 7, just like the true false, it's a two-step equation. Multiply both sides by x. 10.4 equals a negative 2.6x. Second step is to divide by the coefficient. And your value of x will equal, how many 2.6s are there in 10.4? So 10.4 divided by 2.6 should be the positive answer of 4. But negative 4 because it's a positive divided by a negative. Question 8, two-step equation. Actually, it's not too different than a grade 8 question. The only thing is you have decimals. So your constant 6.5, so we're going to add 6.5 to both sides. X divided by 1.5 is equal to 16.6. Multiply by 1.5, and X will equal, well, 8.3, see ya, 8.3, 24.9. X equals 24.9. The reason why I did that is 16.6 times 1 is 16.6. 16.6 times a half is 8.3. 16.6 plus 8.3, 24.9. Question 9, add 5 to both sides. 0.1x equals negative 1.5. Divide by the coefficient. Now again, dividing by a tenth is the same thing as multiplying by its reciprocal. So if you divide by a tenth, you're going to end up with x just multiplying by 10, so negative 15 is your solution. Question 10, two-step algebraic equation with a constant and a coefficient of a fifth. Two ways you could solve it. First way, Andrew, is you could add 3/10 to both sides, right? You could do that. And then you could then, once you do add 3/10 to both sides, you could then multiply both sides by 5. A lot of you remembered that when you have multiple fractions in an equation, multiplying both sides by a common multiple of that denominator will create a non-algebraic equation. So you looked at 5, 10, and 20 and realized I can multiply both sides by 20. So 20 multiplied by a fifth of x, and 20 multiplied by negative 3/10, and 20 multiplied by 19/20. Multiplying every term in that equation by 20 maintains equality, but creates this equation: 4x minus 6 equals 19. So you could either get 20x over 5, which is still 4x, or negative 60 over 10, which is still negative 6, or whatever that works out to be. 400 minus 20 is 380. Yada yada. Once you get that, just add your 6 to both sides. 4x equals 25. Divide both sides by 4, and x will equal 6 1/4, or 25 quarters. Question 11, distributive property. Two ways to solve it. You could have expanded, right, which is no problem. But to a smarter person, Brian, what would a smarter person do? If you have two groups of that is equal to this, dividing it by 2 means that one group of this is equal to this. Agreed? If two groups of this is equal to this amount here, then one group of that should be equal to half as much. In which case, adding the constant to both sides, 1.475x equals 2.95. Divide both sides by the coefficient, and x will equal, how many 1.475s are there in 2.95? There's exactly 2 of them. So my answer, oopsie daisy, that should have been negative, isn't it? Is negative 2. Okay, next question. Could you multiply both sides by 2? Yes. If you multiplied this side by 2, you got this. If you multiply this side by 2, you got 8/5. Then if you add 5 to both sides, x would equal, since 8/5 is actually 1 3/5, then your answer would be 6 3/5. That is one way to solve it, right? Alternatively, what else could you have done? You could have multiplied both sides by what number? 10. Knowing that there's two fractions, if I multiply this side by 10 and multiply this side by 10, I actually ended up with 5x minus 25, because I have to expand using distributive property. And over here, I'd get 8. And when I did that and added 25 to both sides, I got that. When I divided both sides by 5, I got that, which is that. So either way you did it, in this case, what was really the easiest first step? Probably multiplying both sides by 2, right? In this case, probably multiplying both sides by 2 was the best first step. But either way you did it, as long as you understand that there was more than one way to get the answer, that was the important part. Question 13, variables on both sides. Easiest first step or best first step is to get rid of on the side you have the least amount of variable. You end up with this. Subtract 9 from both sides. You get that. Divide both sides by 2. And x will equal -5. Question 14. This is my mistake. And I'm taking full ownership of this, and we can talk about what I did wrong and what. So technically, when I wrote it, I wanted this expression to be this. And I wasn't thinking clearly when I wrote it. So this is really this equation, right? My intention wasn't for it to be this, but I messed that up. So this is really what the question says. Half of x minus 3 is equal to 5x minus 1 over 5, a fifth of that. So once we reread it like that, it actually becomes kind of easier. I have a denominator of 2, a denominator of 5. Don't like fractions. I'm going to multiply this side by 10. I'm going to multiply this side by 10. What's half of x multiplied by 10 in your head? That's really easy. Half of x multiplied by 10, 5x. -3 multiplied by 10, -30. Here's what some people did. They looked at this first one and they cross-reduced, right? They did this on the paper. They got 5x. But guess what they did after that? They kept that cross-reduction and multiplied 5 by -3, right? When it's clearly not that. It's clearly, one more. It's clearly 10 multiplied by half of x and 10 multiplied by -3, right? So that's what you end up getting when you multiply that side by 10. And over here, you get two groups of this binomial, which would be 10x minus 2. So when you multiply both sides of that equation by 10, you end up with this equation. If you remove 5x from both sides, you get that. If you add 2 to both sides, you get that. And if you divide both sides by 5, you get this, which is equal to -5 and 3/5. I would guess that 80% of you had it wrong. 80% of you interpreted this expression to be this. And therefore you got like -2 something. Okay, but this is the work you needed to do. Question 15, distribute a property with variables on both sides. Expand both sides. 1.25 times 6.4. 1.25 times 6.4 equals 8. 8x minus 1.25 times 1.2 minus 1.5 equals 9x minus 3.6. So when you expand properly using distributive property, you get that. Subtract 8x from both sides. Well, that's messy. Negative 1.5 equals x minus 3.6. That's if you subtract 8x from both sides. If you add 3.6 to both sides, 1.8. Is that right? No, 1.1. No, 2.1. X equals 2.1 if you add 3.6 to both sides. Now we get into our story problem. It says Will's cell phone plan is $15.50 a month plus 80 cents a text call. If Will's bill for the month was $113.10, how many text calls did he make? So our first thing is to define our variable, and since that's our question, number of texts or calls. Since it's 80 cents for one of those, 80 cents is going to be our coefficient. 80 cents multiplied by the number of texts or calls, plus the cost of $15.50, which is the plan's cost, will equal his total bill for the month, which is this. Subtract your constant of $15.50 from both sides, and $113.10. Take away $15.50 is $97.60. Divide both sides by the coefficient. Divide both sides by the coefficient of 80 cents a call, and x equals 122. So, define your variable, write your equation, solve the equation. Therefore, the number of texts or calls was 122. Question 17. Two plumbers in town have different fees for service calls. Plumber A charges $45 an hour and a service fee of $40. Plumber B is $4.50 an hour, but a service fee is a little bit more, $76. How many hours would it cost A and B to be exactly the same? So X is going to equal the number of hours, right? Because that's what we're looking for. How many hours? Number of hours. Plumber A has to equal plumber B. So A's expression algebraically is $45 an hour plus $40 I got that backwards. $40 an hour. So 45 multiplied by the number of hours worked plus a service fee of 40. Whereas B is $40.50 multiplied by the number of hours plus a more expensive service fee of $76. So since A has to equal B, then this expression must equal this expression. Have variables on both sides. Get rid of it from the side. So I'm going to subtract 40.5x from both sides. Leaving me with 4.5x plus 40 equals 76. I'm going to subtract 40 from both sides. And x will equal, when I divide both sides by 4.5, x will equal 8. Define your variable. Create two expressions that represent each plumber. Make an equation. Solve the equation. Therefore, after 8 hours, or at 8 hours, for 8 hours, comma, both will charge the same or cost the same. Sentence to explain you knew what you did. And your last question, a lot of people didn't even try it. It's not that hard. It says these two shapes have the same perimeters. So perimeter, of course, is the distance around it. What is the actual non-algebraic perimeters of each shape? That's your question. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up a perimeter for this one. The perimeter of a square is 4 multiplied by the side length. The perimeter of a triangle is 3 multiplied by the side length. So the square will be 4 multiplied by the side length. That's the perimeter of the square. And the perimeter of the triangle will be 3 multiplied by the side length. So when we have this, expand it using distributive property. I think that's right. Once you've expanded it, subtract 6x from both sides. Once you have that, subtract 2.4 from both sides. Oops, 6x equals 11.4. Divide both sides by the coefficient, and x equals 1.9. Now, there were a lot of people who thought you were done, and this is where it becomes interesting, because you can't be done now. All you've solved for is x. And the question does not say, what is the value of x? It says, what is the actual non-algebraic parameters of each shape? So once you have x equals 1.9, you got to go back into the question. And if x equals 1.9, then that is the actual non-algebraic side length of that particular shape. 3 times 1.9 is 5.7. 5.7 plus 0.6 is 6.3. So when I solve that, the side length of that square is 6.3. Multiply that by 4 because there's 4 6.3s, and you get the perimeter is 25.2. The actual non-algebraic perimeter. If I look over here, substitute 1.9 here, the side length of that is 2.8 plus 4.6, 2.8 plus 4.6, can't do it in my head. 7.4, and 7.4 times the 3 sides is also 25.2. They have identical perimeters.